Support for the CivicSciTV network comes from listeners and viewers like you and organizations such as the Rita Allen Foundation, which invests in transformative ideas in their earliest stages to leverage their growth and promote breakthrough solutions to significant problems. Go to ritaallen.org to learn more.
Mapping the global landscape of civic science by dissecting new insights from researchers, practitioners, and leaders in academia, government, for-profit, and nonprofit organizations. This is Questions of the Day with Fanuel Muindi.
Previously on Questions of the Day.
I'm hoping it becomes much more than just a podcast. I don't want to say just a podcast because it's important. It's done a lot, but I want it to be a movement in neuroscience. I'd love to become the face of neuroscience being done in Latin communities, really. And I'd love for the podcast to be a resource for students, even in the classroom. Like perhaps there's a way to make these episodes maybe even shorter, maybe a spin-off series or something like that, where, you know, it's more fun to learn about neuroscience than flipping through your textbook. You could just, hey, you have this podcast, you go listen to it and then tell us what you liked about it. It'd be great to have a show, a TV show of some sort. I think that's my next 5-year plan is.
Welcome back to Questions of the Day. I'm your host, Fanuel Muindi. Very excited to be joined by founder and principal evaluator at Improved Insights, Sarah Dunifon. Sarah, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, we go way back. I was just like you were chatting offline there about where this journey started, several years, in fact. Mm-hmm. And at the time, you were just about to go and start pursuing your doctorate, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to fast forward through all those years, the pain and the joy, all of it, yes, to the present, right? And so you recently finished your thesis and you did your work at the University of Pittsburgh, yes, so doctorate in education. Mm-hmm. In your thesis, an examination of evaluation policies and funding priorities in informal STEM education funding organization, that was just published. I believe you were just done there in June this year. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, because I would love to learn more about what you discovered, right? The key highlights from this work, really beautiful work that is now available for everybody to read. Now, before we do that though, Sarah, tell us, what was the genesis of this work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my career, I think it starts with my early career origins, really. I began as an educator in the informal learning space, working for museums and institutions, teaching the public, and that could be anyone from pre-K students to adults about science and STEM terms and subjects. And so I started as an educator, moved on to be a program coordinator within those spaces, and then focused on program evaluation. I really love the combination of those fields. And so looking at education, program evaluation, I also have an interest in a background in STEM equity, specifically at the higher education level. The nexus of those areas is really where I focus my work. And so when I went into this Doctor of Education program at University of Pittsburgh, I went in with this interest in looking deeper at the field of informal STEM learning. I didn't yet know what topic I wanted to pursue for my research and dissertation, but I was working with an incredible advisor, Dr. Kevin Crowley, and decided to look at some of the systems that are at play within informal STEM ed, or ISE, and how those systems can contribute to inequity or equity, kind of depending on how they're placed. And so one of the things I wanted to look at was the funding system that supports informal STEM education programs. Most ISE is done by nonprofits, and so most of those organizations are beholden to funders to get the money to make their programs happen. And so in looking at those systems behind who gets funding, what programs are funded, what are the expectations for grantees, we focused in on looking at the funding priorities and the evaluation expectations or evaluation policies communicated by those funders. And so that's really where I focused my work for the remainder of my program.
Now, my goodness, there's so much to unpack in there.
Yeah.
So let's just get right into it, Sarah. Terminology.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about informal STEM. You mentioned informal science, ISE. Just break it down for us.
Yes. So informal learning is any learning that happens outside of a formal classroom environment. When most people think about learning, they think about K-12 or higher education. They think about these formal contexts in which you're sitting down for a class, you're having a lecture, maybe you're doing a lab, you're learning in that very structured environment. Informal learning is anything that takes place outside of that context. And it can range from extremely structured to extremely unstructured. So you might have an experience where you're in your kitchen and you're experimenting with how much spices to put into the thing that you're cooking, different proportions. That is informal learning. You might be listening to a radio program about something STEM related, and maybe they say, go out into your yard and see how many pollinators you can count. That's informal learning. You might attend a camp program or a facilitated program at a museum where you're hearing from a curator talk about something that they're exhibiting. That's also formal learning. So informal learning really ranges from those very unstructured contexts to extremely structured programs. Now, when I say informal learning, some people are going to get maybe a little bit confused because they're also familiar with terms like after school learning, summer learning, out of school time learning, or out of school learning. And all of these terms do relate to those out of the classroom environment contexts, but some of them are a little bit more tied to formal education. So after school and summer programs are typically thinking about kids that are school age. And so we need to think about these terms in the sense that they have some nuance to them. They are a little bit different, but they all relate to this out of the school time learning context. And in the context of the dissertation, we use informal learning as a shorthand to mean all of these different fields.
Yeah. Thank you for that breakdown. And in your work, you actually discuss that this permeates itself right into the funders, right? Because the funders have to navigate this terminology landscape. Tell us what you found there about how funders then are relaying this information to the funding opportunities.
Absolutely. So we looked at a ton of different things in this work. So I'm going to zoom in on one portion for right now, which is terminology. Mm-hmm. And when funders are speaking about the types of things that they want to fund, what terms are they using? So we looked at a combination of terms, STEM, STEAM, and specific STEM subjects like engineering or computer science to see when funders are talking about the work that they want to support, what are they talking about? Are they saying STEM, STEAM, engineering, computer science? Because those things really do matter in terms of, are you going to see this is a good opportunity for you if you're a computer science nonprofit, for example. So we looked at that and we found that funders are by and large speaking about STEM or specific STEM subjects. Very few are speaking about STEAM. That actually surprised me because you hear a lot about STEAM in the discourse within this field, but funders are actually not speaking about it or seeing it as a distinct entity that they want to specifically support. So that was quite interesting. For anyone that doesn't know, STEAM is science, technology, engineering, and math. It also includes art. We also looked at how they're speaking about the learning system. So are they using terms like pathways, pipelines, or ecosystems to talk about when folks get involved with STEM, how do they continue to be in that STEM world? I think that historically, we've seen pipeline used more in the past than it is now, and that is true. Fewer funders are using pipelines now to describe their work. They're focusing more on pathways and ecosystems as those learning systems that they want to support. We also looked at after school, out of school, and informal as specific key terms. And while for shorthand we're using informal, we actually find that is the least used among funders right now. But they're very similar in proportion. So the language that funders are using is quite interesting to explore. That is just one piece that we looked at. We also looked at what audiences they define to serve. And that could be anything from age range to how they're speaking about inclusive audiences and maybe folks who are underrepresented or historically excluded from STEM. It's looking at geographic areas. It's looking at family group versus individuals, all sorts of combinations. We also looked at the types of effects that they're hoping to fund. And we looked at the language within that as well. So are they looking to fund workplace development programs, career awareness and interest, personal self-development, skill building? what exactly are they looking to fund? And there's a huge variety of things that funders are talking about, and there is not as much consistency as you might think. People are interested in very different things across the field.
Yeah. So let's just pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah.
You take us back in terms of how did you actually go about doing this work, right?
Yes.
Were you looking at RFPs, right? These requests for proposals, or just funder descriptions online in general? Did you talk to funders? And also, while you're at it, since we're at this, did you talk to any of the fundees, right, who may be looking at these RFPs and so forth, right? So just take us a little bit about the methodology that you use in this.
Yeah. Great. So it was really a two-part study. The first part was first finding who even funds informal STEM education. When we went into this, we expected there to be somewhere a list of organizations that we could cite and say, here are the organizations we're going to look at. That list did not exist. So the first step was to do a landscape analysis to find out who are the organizations that are actually supporting informal STEM education. I can go into depth about that, but I'll skip ahead for the sake of it. Part two was really looking at then what are they saying about what they're funding, so their funding priorities, and their evaluation policies. And so here we did first a gathering of all sorts of different information. So RFPs, solicitations, website copy, FAQ documents, video transcripts, anything on the funder websites that spoke to either of those two things, the funding priorities or the evaluation policies. We gathered all of these materials. We determined if they were a good fit for the study or not based on the content that they had. And then we did a content analysis where we went through and used a deductive coding approach to set up a framework and then see if we could apply any of the codes to the materials that we found. Across an organization's materials, and some had just maybe one or two that spoke to these concepts, and some had several. We would either apply codes or not. So it was more of like a presence absence thing than the frequency that these codes occurred. And then we did a deeper dive on specific codes to say, okay, we know that they're talking about dissemination, and we know they're talking about types of effects and audiences. Now let's see specifically what are they saying about those concepts. And so we did a second qualitative analysis to understand some of the themes that are that emerged from the data in terms of those specific areas.
Wow, I think we can almost do a whole session just on what happened there, right?
Yes.
The methodology, what you tried that didn't work, because you know at the end of the day, you publish, hey, we did this worked and it's beautiful, but actually there's way more stuff that we tried that didn't work. You mentioned evaluation, and this has come up consistently, right? Especially when fundees are trying to apply for grants, they're trying, okay, how will I be evaluated? Can you tell us more about what you found there about how funders are articulating evaluation to fundees more broadly?
Absolutely. So funders are largely interested in the outcomes of programs and if those outcomes align with their goals. So we see that, across the field, when funders are talking about evaluation, they are talking about things in terms of the types of effects that they wish to see. But one of the main findings that we found is that they are way more explicit about the funding priorities, so what they hope to fund, who they hope to fund, than they are about the evaluation policies. Evaluation policies can be anything from who is allowed to conduct the evaluation to if there are any specific methodologies or approaches that they wish that person to enact, to if there's monetary support for the evaluation in the grant, to dissemination and how those results will be shared. So there are many, many components to evaluation policies that we see in other spaces, and lots of folks have written extensively about evaluation policies themselves, and even about evaluation policy within informal STEM education. Cecilia Garibay and Rebecca Teasdale are two great resources for anyone who wants to learn more about this specific concept in ISE. Now, our research showed, again, that funding priorities are the thing they talk about. Evaluation policies are not. But when they are talking about evaluation policies, they are talking mainly about deliverables. So the type of deliverable and the timeline of deliverable were the most coded codes that we had. 38% of organizations were coded for those two, and they were often paired. Type of deliverable meant what type of format are we messaging what we found, or what we found from the evaluation. So typically these are things like annual reports. Then timeline referred to when that thing would be expected, annually. So that's a pretty simple example of what they are talking about most. Now, what they're talking about least tended to be monetary support for evaluation. Only 2 organizations of our 42 actually said that we will specifically fund evaluation, at least in these public-facing resources. Very few also talked about the evaluator, what their role would be, what their credentials should be. Do they need to have a background in this? Are they an internal evaluator, internal to the nonprofit, or an external consultant? Very few also spoke about the type and methodology that they might expect. And that could be the funder saying, we trust you, we want to leave it up to you to determine what's important. It could be that later in the process, they get these guidelines. We're not quite sure, but upfront, we know that that is not a transparent piece of what's communicated. Dissemination fell somewhere in the middle, and that's an interesting one as well, because we know that in the field of informal STEM education, people talk a lot about sharing their results and sharing what they learned, but dissemination is not necessarily something that is explicit and upfront in a lot of these evaluation policies. So that could be something that the field, takes a look at and considers, is that in line with our values?
Yeah. So evaluation, so support for evaluation, you said 2 out of the 42, right?
Yes.
Of organizations actually provided funding. For
explicitly
any rationale as to why that is the case? Why aren't more providing support for those organizations that may say we don't have the capacity to do so? Because I think this is a challenge, right? Most organizations, hey, I want to do evaluation, but it costs money. And if I add this to the grant, it's going to eat up funding space, right, for my actual work, right? So is there a separate pocket of money? So I'm curious if you can just share more about that,
Yeah. Now that's a great point. I think that the monetary support for evaluation is a critical way that we say evaluation is important. If there isn't that explicit support, it is something potentially that could fall by the wayside, could go ignored. And really, evaluation is so crucial because it's how we show that we're making progress towards our goals, and it's how we improve our programs. So it is really critical to see. Again, 2 of the 42 explicitly stated in the upfront that they are supporting evaluation. It is possible that others do, and it is just not communicated in that upfront way. It is baked into the grant, and it's just something you have to take out of the grant separately. The 2 of the 42 who did describe it were both government agencies. And while that does come out of the overall budget, they actually have guidelines for how much that should be. And specifying that, I think, is a really helpful tool in terms of thinking about this as a priority. So I think that's a great point to raise.
I think probably one of those is the NSF AISL grant that you probably are referring to, because that's one of the ones that has an extensive documentation for applicants, right? Did you dig deep into the AISL program? I suspect you did.
We did a little bit. They were actually one of the models that we found that was the best in terms of the explicitness and the transparency of their evaluation policies. So, of course, they have the monetary support explicitly named. They also were the most clear in describing intended audiences. So one interesting thing that we looked at is how many of these organizations were talking about concepts related to diversity, equity, inclusion, access, and justice. And we found that most of them were. However, these commitments to DEAIJ really varied, from folks very broadly saying, this is important to us, to those saying, this is a part of our focus and we expect, our audiences to be included in these groups. We expect your programs to be inclusive and equitable, and here's how that's going to happen. AISL was one of the models that we found that was very explicit with the words that they used, which we appreciated. So one of the things that they say is they specifically described who they consider underrepresented in STEM. A lot of folks just say underrepresented in STEM, and they don't really explain who does that refer to. AISL was very clear with that, which is something that shows that their commitment to transparency and their kind of going above and beyond on evaluation policy and funding priorities was different than a lot of the organizations that spoke very generally to these concepts.
Yeah. And did you also try to categorize with respect to scholarship versus practice in this space, right? So as you know, the NSF AISL has like the scholarship part, and then there are aspects of course, practice in there too. in the funding landscape, what did you see, especially when you venture out the federal funders, right?
Yeah, so we did. We looked at funding program area to see, are they specifying that funds must be used for programs? Could they be used for operational support? Is it used for research? What specifically are funds allowed to be applied towards? And we found that most organizations are looking specifically to fund programs rather than anything else. Having been in nonprofits before, I do know the importance of funding things like operations. And so that is something to think about field-wide. Do we want to be so program focused when there are other areas that would really benefit from funding? But that's what the data says right now, at least when we pulled all this information, which was in the year 2022.
Yeah. And time does fly very quickly. So, I mean, I wish I can just keep talking to you, Sarah. There's so much to unpack in here. So where is this work now headed toward, if you say?
Yeah.
So and another way to frame this is you've been sharing nuggets of action items, right, for funders, right? I was wondering if you can just package us for us, like what's actionable from this body of work and for whom in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in the looking at myself and the folks that have been involved so far, we certainly have ideas for what to do with this next in terms of next iterations of this work. And in terms of involving more folks in the conversation, we found, a lot of good information about where the field is right now. The next step when you put that hat on is to say, where should it be? But we want to be very thoughtful and inclusive with who gets to say what a proper evaluation policy would look like, or what types of tools might help you move towards that future. And so we're really looking at how to convene folks in informal STEM education in a way to have those conversations and to say, we know that being very transparent with evaluation policies is something that can act in service to equity. How do we do that in a way that is best suited for everyone here? So that is something we're thinking about in terms of like a larger concept and grappling. Don't have any specifics on what that's going to look like yet, but we are working on some things. Now, in terms of individuals, I would say that this is really interesting if you are a practitioner. So maybe you work at a nonprofit and you go out for funding. If you're an evaluator and you evaluate programs in the informal STEM education space, or if you are a funder and you fund informal STEM education. If you're a practitioner, you can certainly look at this to see a list of who serves your field and maybe some new ideas for funding. You can also look at what those funders are communicating in terms of the types of programs that they want to support, the types of effects they wish to see, and able to really align that to the work that you're doing. Does it fit? Does it not? Are there different ways that you want to talk about the work that you're doing that better fit into what funders are, at least now, hoping to see? If you're an evaluator, you can look at some of this information and say, what is being explicitly asked for in some of the grants that perhaps I'm aligned with that I need to evaluate? How clear are funders? Are they clear about certain elements? Do I need to bake that into my processes? Do I need more clarification on certain things? It opens up some new questions. And then if you're a funder, I think this is a really important chance for you to take a look at your own evaluation policies and give them a good hard look to decide, are they transparent? Are they clear? Are they equitable? And you can do that by, first of all, understanding if they are explicit, written down. A lot of these evaluation policies happen through kind of word of mouth, or somebody has an idea for something and it's just the way that we've always done it. Well, it might be time to take a look at that and say, does that fit within our values and where we're hoping to move in the next level of this work? And so you can look at the list of codes that we had as some initial fodder for things that you might think about. Are you defining the evaluator, the approach? Are you defining monetary support, dissemination? All of these things are important to look at. You might not have all of them, but it's a great starting point for a conversation.
Is the raw data available for those who are wishing to play with it?
So the dissertation is available. The raw data is not, but we have lots and lots of good detail in that dissertation. You can find it just by Googling my name and dissertation. I'm sure you'll find it pretty quickly. And I'd be, happy to share more insights with anyone who's interested in reaching out to learn more.
Yeah, and we'll share a link down in the chat below. Now, Sarah, there's some things that I'm guessing you probably were not able to do, or even questions that you wish, if I had the time, I would have asked this question as well in my research, right? Can you share that aspect? What are some things that are not in this thing that you just wish, if you had the time or maybe more funding or resources, you would have done it?
Yes, great question. And this actually harkens back to something you said earlier. We did not get a chance to look at the process of evaluation policy development within these organizations. We largely looked at the end product, which is whatever was public facing. We did not speak to individuals about what does that process look like in their organization. So maybe that's a future iteration of this work. Maybe somebody else wants to, carry that forward. But that would be a really interesting thing to look at in terms of how these are developed, who's involved in the development of evaluation policies, how often are they looked at and revised. All of those things would be quite interesting to explore.
Yeah. And of course, collaborations I can already see, right? Potentially people working together to decipher this. Now, I want to focus a little bit about you now. So how are you using this in your own work right now through improved insights?
Yeah, great question. So I think that, part of the work that I do, of course, is that direct program evaluation work. But I am also somebody who really is striving to be in support of and in connection with the informal STEM education community writ large. So some of the work that I'm doing right now is writing about informal STEM education concepts and informal STEM education evaluation concepts, sharing what I've learned through this dissertation with clients and just the general community to say, here's how this might help improve your practice. And so there's a little bit of it that definitely informs my own personal practice when I'm, working with a client and thinking about how do we want to adhere to grant guidelines, for example. But also, I think just for the general ISE community as a whole, this is extremely beneficial. And so communicating that and kind of sharing what I've learned and giving back in this way is definitely something that I've been working on through practitioner articles, hoping to get a couple peer-reviewed articles, and then blog posts as well.
Yeah, and I'm also imagining for new funders who want to get into the space, right? One, they come to you, right, to your practice to say, hey, how do I think about evaluation for my funding opportunity? More broadly, just thinking about the landscape. So can you share a little bit about that? Like what advice, or have you seen that already? Like some new funders, right, that are coming online and saying, I want to get involved.
Yeah. So that's something that we're thinking about right now in terms of like, how can we help develop a toolkit or convene folks to talk about how to give guidance to those types of organizations. I'll say from just my specific perspective and having worked on this so far, I would say the first step is taking a look at any policies or practices that you have already, and it might be none. If you're a new funder and you don't have those things established yet, that's okay. As long as you are taking the time to sit with these concepts and think about, what will they mean for your work? What concepts do you need to talk more about with your stakeholders, with your board, with your audiences, and come up with clear policies that communicate your expectations for both funding, but also evaluation.
Yeah. And last but not least, you focus primarily on organizations in the US. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah. So when we did our vetting of that initial list of organizations, and we went from 142 that were kind of on our short list to vet down to 138 down to 42, we looked at organizations that are currently active, that are funding nonprofits, and that are funding organizations that focus their efforts in the United States. So certainly an extension of this work that would be really interesting is looking globally at what funding networks exist elsewhere and what those organizations say about the work that they're doing.
Wonderful. Well, that means we have to talk more for sure. Sarah, thank you so much for these insights.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.